Scientists create a unique plant intended to make people happy, but instead, it drives them insane.
All of us who've inhaled the pollen, we belong together now.
In the greenhouse of a research center, genetic engineering specialist Alice Woodard presents her unique creation to the management, a plant whose scent makes people happy. Unlike most new plant species, which are bred to be low maintenance and thus lose their fragrance, Alice and her team created the opposite. Her plants require regular watering and care, but in return, they emit a scent that induces feelings of happiness. Alice's colleague Chris notes that the scent contains a precursor to the hormone oxytocin, which forms bonds between mother and child.
The first mood-lifting, antidepressant, happy plant.
Meanwhile, Alice's son Joe waits for her in her office. Alice is raising him on her own. Chris, returning from the greenhouse, tells Joe that his mom will be free soon and suddenly compliments Joe's sneakers. Later, Alice and Joe leave the research center. On the way home, Joe shares his thoughts about the day and mentions during dinner that Chris definitely likes her. Alice is puzzled by this, but Joe insists it's obvious from Chris's behavior. He suggests that Alice should consider Chris since he's smart and shares common interests with her. Alice brushes off the idea and changes the subject. She tells Joe that his father wants to see him more often, but Joe thinks they are too different and says he finds him uninteresting. The next day, Alice visits her therapist, sharing her concerns about launching the new Happiness Flowers program. The scientist hopes everything will go as planned but admits she might have made an unforeseen mistake. Alice is also worried that she's not spending enough time with Joe. She fears something terrible might happen to him, and she won't be there for him. Meanwhile, Alice's colleague Bella arrives at the greenhouse, bringing her dog Bello, whom she leaves in the corridor. Bella then starts working on another type of plant, more resilient blue flowers. Nearby, Alice and Chris work on the happiness flowers, raising the temperature in the lab since the plants need warmth. Later, Chris confides that he's very proud of their joint work, but Alice cautions that it's too early to celebrate. Chris suggests they go out in the evening, but Alice declines and instead assigns him additional tasks. That evening, Alice secretly takes one of the plants home. She shows it to Joe and explains that it needs to be talked to and well cared for. Alice also suggests they name it Little Joe in honor of him.
Hi, Little Joe.
Welcome.
The next day, the happiness flowers bloom and release a massive amount of pollen, causing all of Bella's blue flowers to die. Alice explains to her colleagues that her plant is sterile and might be producing large quantities of pollen in response to its infertility. However, her supervisor, Carl, who was working on the blue flowers with Bella, believes Alice's experiment has gone out of control and that her happiness flowers have destroyed his new species. Alice insists that the pollen is not to blame, noting that most new species do not survive. Nevertheless, she continues to face accusations of using illegal breeding methods and concerns that her plants could unpredictably affect the environment.
A genetically engineered plant spreading unknown allergens. Hello?
Carl orders all the scientists to wear masks until further notice, and everyone goes back to work. Later, Bella and Carl notice that the blue flowers have deteriorated further, confirming that the pollen is indeed responsible. At the end of the workday, Alice mentions that her son has gone to his father's for the weekend. Chris takes the opportunity to invite her out again. Alice hesitantly agrees, but they are interrupted by Bella, who says that Bello is missing. She worries that he might have been accidentally locked in the greenhouse, so Chris goes to look for him. At first, Chris thinks the greenhouse is empty, but suddenly Bello lunges at him, nearly knocking him over. Chris stumbles and falls into the flowers, inhaling the mysterious pollen. Bello's strange behavior surprises him, but after breathing in the pollen, Chris starts acting a bit differently himself. At the bar, Alice mentions that Joe thinks she and Chris are a great match. Suddenly, the usually shy and reserved Chris tries to kiss Alice, but she dodges him. Chris then goes to get drinks and eventually manages to kiss Alice, though without her consent. The next day at the research center, Bella tries to pet Bello, but he suddenly becomes aggressive and bites her. Bella is very upset by the changes in her dog's behavior, and Alice suggests he might be sick. Later in the cafeteria, Alice asks Chris why Bella is so distressed about Bello. Chris explains that Bella has mental health issues and once took a whole year off on medical leave. She used to be one of the top breeders, but after her break, she was demoted. Now, the loss of her flowers and Bello's strange behavior are taking a toll on her. Meanwhile, at home, Joe is texting his friend Selma. She shows little interest in the photos of his ant farm aquarium and takes a long time to reply. So, Joe decides to take a selfie with the unusual Little Joe, which Selma likes much more. He then waters the flower and talks to it, and Little Joe blooms right before his eyes. Joe leans in to smell the flower but suddenly starts sneezing from the toxic pollen. Soon, Alice returns home and apologizes to Joe for being late. However, Joe doesn't respond or even look at her, staring at the TV instead. Alice checks the fridge and offers to order something for dinner, but Joe abruptly says he's not hungry. His behavior alarms Alice since he's never spoken to her in such a tone before. The next day at work, Alice sees Bella and asks why she didn't bring her dog today. Bella says that Bella was no longer the same, so she decided to put him down. That evening, Bella comes to Alice's home, insisting they need to talk. Settling into a chair, Bella explains that Bella was like a son to her and asks Alice to imagine how she would feel if Joe suddenly changed. Bella asserts that little Joe is to blame, claiming it's pollen-affected Bello. Initially, she thought it was an allergy, but tests showed no changes. Alice tries to assure Bella that her flower is likely not the cause, but Bella is convinced otherwise. Bella shows Alice a magazine article about pathways to the brain. She explains that pollen reaches the olfactory receptors through the nose, transmitting information to the brain area responsible for emotions, behavior, and personality. While oxytocin in little Joe's pollen was supposed to affect this part, it seems there is something else in it. Alice continues to insist that her flower has nothing to do with Bella's dog. However, Bella claims that Chris has also changed significantly due to the pollen. She hints that the pollen could affect Joe as well, forcing Alice to decide who is more important, little Joe or her real son. That evening, Alice looks at the flower, remembering Bella's words, and starts to doubt it. The next day, Alice visits her therapist again, sharing Bella's theory but insisting it can't be true because her flower is completely safe. Later, Carl summons Chris and Alice, accusing them of planting new species without permission or allergen testing.
For us, safety is more important than success.
Alice, surprised, claims she knows nothing about this but insists her plant is safe. She admits that one happiness flower is at home with her, asserting that neither she nor her son has had any problems, refusing to acknowledge the obvious changes in Joe's behavior. Carl reminds her that she broke the rules and is about to freeze the project. However, Chris points out that if they miss the exhibition this year, other breeders might steal their idea. Reluctantly, Carl agrees to continue working on the happiness flowers but states they won't be sold until test results confirm their safety. Chris and Alice return to the greenhouse, where the happiness flowers have taken over the tables that previously held Bella's blue flowers. Alice, irritated, asks why Chris didn't warn her, but he calmly asks her to trust him, assuring her he knows what he's doing. Alice then reviews interviews with people who have experienced the effects of little Joe. In one video, a girl talks about feeling better, but her worried mother adds that she has changed a lot since they got the plant. Suddenly, the video cuts off, and Alice starts doubting little Joe's safety but keeps her concerns to herself. Meanwhile, Joe goes fishing with his father. The boy remains withdrawn and uncommunicative. When the man brings Joe home, he asks Alice if she's noticed any strange behavior in Joe, but she doesn't respond. That evening, Alice studies the magazine Bella left her and then goes to bed. During the night, Joe sneaks into Alice's room and steals her lab key. He meets up with Selma, and they head to the research center, where Joe shows her hundreds of little Joes in the greenhouse. They examine the unusual plants closely, but suddenly, a surveillance camera turns toward them. Joe and Selma immediately hide under a table as the flowers begin releasing a lot of pollen. The pollen seems to make them feel more mature and serious, and suddenly Selma decides to kiss Joe. Then the camera moves again, and the pair stands up, deciding to take one of the flowers with them. The next day, Carl shows Alice and Chris the footage from the camera and points out that one little Joe went missing during the night. He can't understand why anyone would steal a flower, but then Alice notices the edge of a shoe in the video and realizes it was her son. In the hallway, Bella stops Alice and asserts that little Joe is infecting people to reproduce. This is how it tries to survive, as a response to its sterility.
It's complete nonsense.
But Bella insists on her version of events. The flower changes those it infects so they will protect it, spread it, and care for it more than anything else. Bella declares they can keep pretending everything is fine, even though it's not, and hands Alice a flash drive that will help her realize this. Alice goes home and finds the full recording of the interview with the mother and daughter on the flash drive, as well as stories of other people who were changed by little Joe's pollen. Then Alice goes to her son's room and sees he's working on a school project with Selma. She invites Selma to stay for dinner, during which she observes their unusually mature behavior for teenagers. Alice wants to talk to her son about his break-in at the lab, but Joe interrupts her, saying that he's gotten closer to his father lately and, given how busy Alice is with work, he wants to move in with his dad. Alice is completely against this idea, and then Joe and Selma get up from the table and start to leave the house. Shocked, Alice grabs Joe's arm, but he pulls away and pushes her. Seeing his mother hit her head, Joe offers to put a bandage on it. Later, Alice observes Joe and Selma, who didn't end up leaving, lovingly caring for little Joe. She then notices Joe's aquarium and sees that all his ants have died. To his mother's surprise, Joe says he can't take care of everything. The next day, Alice's colleague Rick comes into the lab and finds that many of the little Joe samples haven't survived because of the very low temperature in the room. Rick blames Bella, but she insists she had nothing to do with it. During lunch, Alice and Chris discuss Bella's attitude toward little Joe, and Alice suddenly says that maybe Bella is right. The virus in one of the genes might have mutated and become pathogenic. Chris thinks this is nonsense, but Alice insists that the flower might indeed be trying to overcome its sterility this way. Alice notes that they shouldn't have made little Joe sterile, as it's unnatural, but Chris reminds her that it was necessary as a safety measure for genetic engineering, to prevent these plants from reproducing uncontrollably, as well as for commercial reasons. Chris also warns that if Alice tells anyone they created a virus dangerous to humans, their careers will be over, so she should keep quiet. Alice shares her concerns about Joe's strange behavior with Chris, but he assures her that it's just part of growing up and suggests talking to him. Alice picks up her son from school, but at first, he pretends not to see her. Then he gets in the car as if nothing happened. On the way, she suggests they do something together over the weekend, but he says he has other plans. Meanwhile, Bella continues working in the lab. Suddenly, Rick approaches her and asks if she can feed the plants for him, as he needs to leave early. He gives her the access code and leaves, and Bella, wearing a mask, goes to the greenhouse where she diligently cares for the dangerous plants. Suddenly, it gets warmer in the greenhouse, and the doors lock. Soon, the flowers start releasing pollen, but Bella manages to open a window and avoid catching the virus. The next morning, Alice wants to talk to Bella, but Bella pretends that the pollen has affected her. She claims she was wrong about little Joe and that her previous behavior was due to her unstable mental state. Soon after, Alice visits her therapist again. She explains that Bella suddenly changed her mind and suspects that the pollen is to blame. Alice also confesses that she no longer recognizes her son. However, the therapist suggests that Bella's fears have triggered similar fears in Alice and that she's finding it easier to interpret her son's growing up as a reaction to the plant. That evening, Alice returns home to find Chris talking with Joe and Selma in her absence. She asks him to leave, and outside, he suddenly tells her that he loves her and that her son is fine. Alice doesn't respond to his words and says she'll handle her son on her own. Back inside, Alice brings up the subject of what Joe and Selma were doing in the greenhouse. They explain that they wanted to get a flower for Joe's father so he could become one of them. Alice doesn't understand what they mean, and Joe explains that everyone who breathes in the pollen feels boundless happiness. He and Selma suggest that Alice also inhale the pollen and become one of them. They assure her that she won't notice any changes in herself but that she will be happy.
It's like being dead. You don't notice you're dead, do you?
Alice is shocked by the children's words, but then they start laughing and assure her they were just joking after hearing about the problems with little Joe from Chris. Joe says he's fine, he's just growing up and wants to spend more time with his father. The next day, Alice confesses to Carl that she had deceived them by using unapproved viral vectors in the creation of little Joe. However, now that Carl has obviously inhaled the pollen, he doesn't see this as a problem. He sees no reason to shut down the project, as these vectors will be approved eventually. Alice explains the pathogenic effect the virus has on people's brains and shows him the relevant journal. She confirms that while people do indeed become happy, it's not the kind of happiness they intended to achieve. The consequences could be catastrophic, as people stop caring about anything except the flower. Convincing Carl that another genome check is necessary, Alice collects the necessary samples to send for further research. Then, along with Bella and Rick, she goes to the greenhouse, where they continue caring for the plants. Suddenly, Bella finds her dog's ball among the flowers and can't hold back her tears. However, such behavior is strange for someone who has inhaled the pollen. During lunch, she admits to all her colleagues that she never inhaled the pollen and was just pretending. She confesses that her dog, Bello, is the only creature she ever loved and that no flower could ever replace him.
You're no longer your real selves.
All the infected colleagues think Bella's mental health issues have flared up again, and Carl offers her some medication. Bella insists she's fine and runs away. Carl and Chris immediately chase after her, and suddenly she falls down the stairs. Alice arrives shortly after and accuses them of pushing her, but the men insist they didn't do it. Bella is still fighting for her life in the hospital, while Carl urges the team to focus on the upcoming exhibition, as tests have confirmed the safety of the flowers of happiness. He also announces that masks are no longer necessary in the greenhouse. That evening, Alice sneaks into the greenhouse and lowers the temperature, hoping all the plants will die overnight. However, Chris catches her. She claims she was just checking the thermostat and that the temperature is normal, but Chris senses the room is cooler than usual. Realizing that Alice wants to destroy the plants, Chris tries to persuade her not to do it. However, Alice refuses to listen, and Chris is forced to take the key from her by force. Chris calmly raises the temperature back up and then removes Alice's mask, forcing her to finally inhale the pollen. The next day, Carl announces that little Joe has been nominated for the European Health Award. Additionally, they have already received orders for the Flowers of Happiness from the Board of Education and the Ministry of Health, and soon they will be supplying little Joe worldwide. Carl praises Alice, calling her the best breeder, and congratulates everyone on their success. Chris then apologizes for his behavior in the greenhouse, but Alice tells him he did the right thing since she could have destroyed all the flowers, and then she kisses him. At home, Alice tells her son that she is no longer opposed to him living with his father, admitting that she was just afraid of losing him before, but now she has little Joe, and she can take care of him. Alice takes her son to his father's house and then visits her therapist. She now says that her plant doesn't affect people, and all her doubts were caused by guilt over spending more time with little Joe than with her son. She also feels that subconsciously, she always wanted Joe to move in with his father so she would have more time for work and herself. Alice then returns home and lovingly wishes little Joe good night, feeling as if the plant reciprocates her affection. How do you think the world would change if millions of people started caring solely about the well-being of plants? And what, in your opinion, is the real-world equivalent of such a flower of happiness? Share your thoughts in the comments below, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.